The sixth pastor was Robert Pollard Kerr, from 1884 to 1903. He arrived in Richmond. I'm not sure exactly how the thing worked with the city, but before he got here, we had been ordered, or it had been decided that the city would take the property downtown, and so the church moved in the first year he was here to Madison and Grace. Tyler's Encyclopedia of Virginia Biography says about Kerr, few pastors ever gained the love and admiration of their people or the high esteem of others to a greater extent than did Dr. Kerr while in Richmond. His departure was greatly regretted by all who knew him, and their numbers were legion, for his labors were not confined to his own church. He was always active in every general movement for the spiritual or moral uplift of the city, and was probably the best known minister in Richmond. On a personal note, I'm interested in Dr. Kerr, and I can tell you that he was held in very high, I know he was held in very high esteem in the Johnston household. My father was born in 1903. He had a younger sister who was born in 1910. That's 7 years after Dr. Kerr left. And she was named, actually they told me they thought she was going to be a he, and he was going to be named Robert Kerr Johnston. In fact, it was a girl, and my aunt is Roberta Kerr Johnston. It's not a very good portrait of Dr. Kerr. I hate to say it. I'm not sure what the provenance is of that portrait. The seventh pastor, Frank McFadden. Now, I say McFadden. I know people do say McFadden. Nancy Bain told me that Marie Carson said McFadden, so I am saying McFadden. Now, we're really, in a sense, talking about the modern era because direct descendants of Dr. McFadden are members of the church today. He had a daughter, Mary. She married Lawrence Caldwell. They had a son, Larry Caldwell. Many people here knew Larry. His second marriage, he was married to Jenny, who worked in the office for many years. They had a son, Larry Caldwell III, who is a member of the church, and Larry III has a son who's a member of our church today. Dr. McFadden was here for 19 years. Tyler's encyclopedia says, less the doctrinal theologian than the whole-souled, sympathetic, broad-minded, earnest preacher of the pure gospel of his master. Dr. McFadden resigned his pastorate in 1922 to become the head of the General Assembly Training School in Richmond, which of course became Presbyterian School of Christian Education. Now, Dr. McFadden was succeeded by Walter Lapsley Carson. That's a very famous name in the history of the church. I grew up under Dr. Carson. My parents were disciples of Dr. Carson. He was here for 37 years, the longest serving pastor in the history of the church. He died while he was still serving as an active pastor. He led the move across the boulevard to Lock Lane. Blanton's History of Second Pres says in 1939, not without some acrimony and regrets, the fine old church at Madison and Grace was sold, and a lot was purchased, and a church school building was erected at Lock Lane and Carey Street Road in West Hampton. At the time of the move, the church lost a not inconsiderable number of its members and a majority of its session. But Dr. Carson persevered, and he established First Presbyterian Church as we know it today here at Lock Lane and Carey Street. The portrait of Dr. Carson, painted by, guess who? David Sylvette. The 9th pastor, Edwin Kelsey, Region, he was the shortest term of any of our pastors. He came to Richmond from White Memorial in Raleigh. Turned out he had been John Hager's minister in Durham, North Carolina. John knew him when he got here. People thought very highly of Kelsey, Region. He was taken ill. He died in 1965. His son, John Region, was a longtime pastor at Salisbury Presbyterian Church. Many of you may have known him. Portrait painted by David Sylvette. The 10th pastor, James Archibald Jones III, Jim Jones. Jim was here from 1966 to 1973. It's hard to believe. Jim was 27 years old when he became the pastor. My mother was on that search committee, and I can tell you, if you raised a question whether Jim was old enough to take that position, she would take your head off. There was no question in her mind. It was a very turbulent time in Richmond and in the world when Jim was here. We had the Richmond school desegregation issues, the Vietnam War. We had Union Theological Seminary students who were coming after church to hold programs here protesting the Vietnam War. Those of you who heard Jim Farnham when we dedicated the memorial tablet to Jim Jones in 2007, Jim gave a very moving tribute to Jim Jones. During Jim's time as pastor, we had the first woman elder ordained. We had the first woman deacon ordained. In 1973, though, Jim's wife, Carol, was from Tyler, Texas, and I think Carol wanted to go home because the First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, issued a call to Jim, which he accepted, and he returned to Tyler, Texas. I should go back for a second. The portrait of Jim, David Sylvette had died, and in the art world, the mantle fell to Hugo Stevens. That is a Hugo Stevens portrait. 11th pastor, Jack Sadler, 1974 to 1999. Most people in the room here today know Jack very well. Jack had a firm grip on what happened here under his watch, and a lot of things happened, a lot of great things. He had some excellent assistant ministers, Walter Mann, Rosalind Banbury, Randy Stevens, the building expansion, the new Andover organ that we dedicated in 1989, the rehabilitation of the sanctuary in 1996, which was the first time since 1950. And in addition to those duties, Jack was extremely active in foreign missions oversight for the General Assembly. He traveled around the globe. He retired in 1999, and he and Phyllis live today in Montreat, North Carolina. The portrait of Jack was given by a now deceased member of the congregation who designated Louis Briel here in Richmond. Louis Briel is a well-established artist, but I will be honest and I'll tell you that there are people who wish we could get a more traditional portrait of Jack to go with the other portraits that we've got. The 12th pastor came in 2001, Charles Allen Summers. We've got three wonderful associate ministers today, Rosalind Banbury, Mary Kay Collins, Chris Mooney. The history of First Presbyterian Church is still being written.